Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book of short stories that I finished reading a couple weeks ago called How It Went, 13 More Stories of the Port William Membership, written by Wendell Berry. So this is a book that I read with a small group in our church. It was just sort of an informal summer book group, and we got together once a week and talked through 2 or 3 stories from this collection. This is the most recent of Wendell Berry's short stories that he's written. This was published in 2022, but he has written a lot of novels and short stories about this fictional community called Port William, Kentucky, which is sort of loosely based on the part of Kentucky that he actually lives in. So I am a huge Wendell Berry fan. I have read, I think, all of his fiction now, and he's written a lot of poetry and essays as well. I've read some, but less of that. You can actually see up here on my shelf a lot of my Wendell Berry books that are, again, set in this same town and community. So one of the interesting things about Wendell Berry, if you haven't read his fiction before, is that everything he writes in terms of fiction, whether it's his novels, his short stories, is all based in the same community and kind of spanning the life of that community from the late 1800s up to kind of the present day. So he has stories, even in this book and in some of his other ones, that bring you into the 2000s. But what he sort of tends to focus on, kind of the heart of his stories, is sort of small town, rural communities and life in that window where America in particular is feeling the effects of industrialization and urbanization, and you have what he's described in some of his essays as the unsettling of America. So we're used in our thinking about American history and kind of American mythology, one of the big narrative arcs is, American settlement, the frontier, going out and establishing these farms and towns and communities and seeing America kind of grow out of the wilderness, as it were. But an untold story, or at least a less emphasized story, is the story of the unsettling of America, where you see kind of in the post-war period, after World War II, you really begin to see very rapidly accelerating the dissolution of many of those towns and communities that had been established, 100, 200, 300 years prior, depending on where you are in the American continent. And Wendell Berry is telling that story of the unsettling of America, of how these tightly knit, close farming communities kind of drift apart, and the loss that comes with that, whether that's young men going off to war and never coming home because they die or are missing in action, or whether it's people who voluntarily are leaving the community they've grown up in to go to school or get a job or seek some better dream somewhere else. And so you sort of see, the main character, in a sense, of all of these Port William stories is Port William itself. It's the town itself and the community that's formed around that. So it's a fascinating window into a really important part of American history and American culture. But Berry is exploring that story not so much from a historical or sociological perspective as he is from a kind of personal and philosophical perspective. So he's really concerned about the characters that are there, and he has richly populated the Port William membership with some really fascinating characters. And so one of the fun things about reading his fiction is you might be popping into this timeline or the story at different points in time, but you'll meet the same characters over and over again. Jayber Crow and Hannah Coulter and Bertie Coulter, or Burley Coulter, and all these different characters, and all these families are kind of interconnected and intermarried. So it's really a rewarding experience. The more you give yourself to Berry's fiction, the more you'll get out of it, which is, I think, itself kind of a picture of Berry's way of thinking. The more you give yourself to the community, the more you give yourself to what's in front of you, the more you will get out of it. And so if you have read Berry's novels or fiction, you will really enjoy these 13 new stories from the Port William membership. We, in our book group, had a couple of people who are big Wendell Berry fans. One of the guys in the group had not just read Berry's work, but he was sort of taking this summer to reread all of Berry's fiction, and so he was very up to date on all of the connections and the family ties and the histories and the stories, so he was getting a lot out of it. We also had a number of people who had never had the chance to read Wendell Berry before, and so for some of them this was kind of their introduction, and I think it worked on both counts as sort of an intro to Berry's writings and also a wonderful addition for those who were already fans or already familiar with it. So this is a collection of 13 short stories, which each of them stand alone in an important sense. You could pick up any one of the stories and they would work as a short story on its own. There's not a sort of one overarching narrative that's being communicated, I don't think, and there's not a linear progression from kind of earlier to latter days necessarily. However, I think there are some ways in which these 13 stories are held together very naturally and organically. They were originally written over a number of years, published in different places, and he's pulled them together now to be published here for the first time. So in that sense, each of them is occasional, each of them stands on its own. However, there are a few things, like I say, that I think do kind of connect them. Obviously, one of the connections is what I've already mentioned. All of Berry's fiction, including these, are really Port William stories. They're stories about this farming community in rural Kentucky, especially focusing on kind of the post-war period as you see the kind of life of that community peaking and then beginning its long decline. So one is just sort of the setting and the characters. The other, though, is that all of the short stories in this collection are narrated by and feature Andy Catlett. Now, Andy Catlett is a fascinating character in the kind of Port William membership because Wendell Berry has said Andy Catlett is him. In fact, Andy Catlett and Wendell Berry are born in the same year, so he is, when he's writing about Andy, he is sort of seeing himself in that. And so Andy Catlett is often either receiving these stories, or he's telling these stories, or he's observing these stories as they're happening. He kind of plays different roles. Some of them are about him. Many of them are about the membership, but sort of seen through his eyes or through his memory. And I think that's something that really came out in this book in particular. And, you know, Wendell Berry has done this in a lot of his other writings. In many ways, it is an exercise in memory. But that came out very strongly in this book. And I think some of that is, this was written just a few years ago. Wendell Berry just turned 90, I think, like a couple weeks ago. So he's an old man, and he's lived a lot of life. And there's that, as I think often happens as we age, you begin to look backward as much as you look forward. In fact, for many, backward is where you find the greatest life, because so many people that you have grown up with and lived with have already gone. And so the present can be kind of empty, the future can be kind of bleak, and so you look to the past and remember those things, and you want to carry on the good that you experienced and that you saw and that you were a witness to. And so Andy Catlett is doing that in this book, and of course behind that is Wendell Berry doing that in this book. So I think there's not only the kind of setting of Port William and the cast of characters that we've come to be familiar with and expect, but also the narrator of Andy Catlett is someone that kind of holds it all together. And along with that theme of Andy's remembrances of his life and of the characters who were there. One of the things that you'll find as you read Wendell Berry, and it's true of this collection of stories as well, is that the heartbeat of it is the people. It's the characters. In fact, if you were to try to sort of summarize the plots of a lot of these short stories, it would feel like there's nothing to it. One of my favorite stories in here is basically a story about Andy as a young boy learning how to work alongside one of his grandfather's farm helpers. Another great short story in here is about Andy Catlett when he was a young boy, kind of wandering off in the woods and finding a beautiful clearing. You know, and you can kind of go on from there. Some of the stories, you know, are really funny and they've got lots of plot and things, but most of them don't. Really what drives it are the characters and the way it's described. And it's very richly narrated and imagined. And one of the things you see from Andy Catlett, his perspective, and I think, again, this is Wendell Berry, is just a keen observation. He always has his eyes and ears open. He's thinking, he's observing, he's storing away, he's remembering. And we get to kind of step into that way of thinking. And it's such a breath of fresh air. In our day and age where so much is fast-paced, where memory is something that we've relegated to machines, literally our memory is on our devices, the way that Barry approaches and interacts with the world, and the way that everyone approached and interacted with the world, prior to our own generation or the last generation or two, is something that can feel very foreign, but it's very kind of refreshing and bracing. And so Barry has a great way of just kind of challenging both explicitly and implicitly a lot of the kind of default assumptions and ways of life that we have, and calling us back to something different and something better in many ways. It's not just an exercise in nostalgia. He's not just calling everybody to kind of move back to the farm or leave the city or abandon technology, but he is calling us to count the cost. What have we lost as we've given up those things, and what might it look like to pursue a community that has the richness that is often had been left behind? I think a weakness in Barry's writing, and we talked about this a lot in our group, is that while he is in many ways informed by Christianity and kind of Protestant religion generically, it's in the background. You can tell for him, the church in particular is not really an object of membership or community. It sort of exists on the outside, or sometimes sort of parasitically on the community. And I think that leaves him with a heavier note of lament than is necessarily good or right, because I think he misses that God has established the church to be that core and that hub. Even when other societies and memberships and towns and countries and allegiances are rising and falling, we have that undying membership in the communion of the saints and in fellowship with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And Barry is aware of some of those categories, but I don't think they weigh heavily enough on his heart or shape his paradigm sufficiently. And so that leaves him, I think, casting around a little bit. However, although there is that note of lament and loss that runs throughout the stories, and I think is especially heavy in kind of the beginning and middle of the book, again, that general Christian perspective still comes out. At the end, one of the last stories is called A Rainbow, and it ends with a note of hope. It ends with a note of celebration. It ends with a note of connection, that he's not able to look at the present or the future. Even seeing all that's been lost, he's not able to look at his life or the life of Port William as fundamentally a tragedy. It's still a comedy, classically speaking, meaning it is still a story that ends with joy and with hope. And I don't think Barry grounds that hope as concretely as he could in the work of Christ and the hope of the gospel, but he's pointing toward it. So his work is really rich. It's really wonderful. As I said, he is writing not as an evangelical Christian himself. So there will be things in the book. Occasionally there's language in the book or some sort of allusions or innuendos that I wouldn't have put in there. They're not as egregious as they could be, but just as a heads up, if you're listening to this with your kids or something, or just don't want you to be caught off guard by that. But if you can kind of, sift through that, the stories overall, and many of them have nothing objectionable, but even those that, there are things here or there, all of the stories are well imagined, all of them are rich, all of them are going to stretch you, and all of them will challenge you to sort of look at how you are tied into community in your own life. So I love Wendell Berry, and I really enjoyed this book, How It Went, 13 More Stories of the Port William Membership by Wendell Berry.